Welcome to Both Sides Sometimes Cool. Myself, Ashley, and Ed. Good evening, Ed.
Good evening, Ash. How are you this? It's Good Friday. How are you this Good Friday evening?
Yeah, well, very good, thank you. I think this show will go out fairly soon, so it's not Good Friday 2026 or 2027. Okay, so 2025. But yeah, nice, sunny day of the week. What can I say? We're also joined by James Sylvester, the third bow tie.
We are. How are we doing, chaps?
Good, good. And Ed, well, even better because we're joined by a very, very special guest. Edward, last year you embarked upon reading the novelizations of Bond. Um, you've read pretty much every book, including all the books by this gentleman that we've got joining us tonight. So we were joined by James Bond royalty. Who are we joined by, Ed?
We are joined tonight by a very special guest, author Mr. Raymond Benson. Good evening, Raymond.
Hello, guys. Hello, podcast world. Nice to be here.
So, Raymond, thank you so much for coming on. As Ash said there, I'm on an odyssey reading through all the Bond books. I started yours in January with 0-10. I finished yours mid-March, so it's really good timing you coming on now. So, again, massive thank you for coming on. First question, really, was there a point in your life when you suddenly realized that a writer is actually what you wanted to be?
Well, that's pretty interesting because I decided very late in life that I would start writing. I was a theater major in college. I was totally into the drama thing in high school and before that, and in college too. And I wanted to be a stage director. And I'm also a composer, a music composer. I play the piano, and I would do a lot of composing, collaborating with playwrights and putting music to their words and creating musicals. And after college and a stint at a regional theater, I moved to New York City. And so I was doing theater way off Broadway and directing plays and composing music and doing all that. And this was into the 80s by now. And, um, I mean, it's like a lot of the arts going into film or acting or painting or whatever, music. Uh, it's a tough life. you know, you don't make much money at it. You get a lot of creative fulfillment, and I did absolutely, and I did make some money. But I realized that that was not going to be a lifelong goal. So the whole thing with the James Bond Bedside Companion happened. Are you aware of that? This was my nonfiction book that I wrote in the early 80s. This was a lark, really. It was uh, something I just kind of wanted to do, a labor of love, so to speak, um, because I was a big James Bond fan. And there was, at that time, no book that covered everything in one book, that covered Ian Fleming's life, a history of the phenomenon, analyses and critiques of all the books and all the movies up to that point. I wanted that book, and I realized, well, if I want to put it on my shelf, I'm going to have to write it. And I did pitch it to a publisher, and immediately got a contract to write it. But it took 3 years. I did a lot of research. I traveled to England. I met members of Ian Fleming's family, a lot of his friends and colleagues, people like Ivor Bryce and Ernest Cuneo, and major figures in his life. And finally, the book came out in America in 1984. It was published in an updated edition in the UK in 1988, and that kind of established me in not only in as a published author, but in the world of James Bond. Um, and I would start making appearances at, like, fan conventions and things. And I started writing for the fan club, the American fan club. And, staying in touch with basically, back then it was called Glidrose Publications. Now it's called Ian Fleming Publications. They're the publishing company that published the literary side of James Bond. And at that time, John Gardner was writing. But I stayed in touch with Peter Jansen Smith, who was the chairman of Ian Fleming Publications, and he was actually Ian Fleming's literary agent back in the day. So, and then I fell into the whole computer gaming industry almost by accident, because as a result of the James Bond Bedside Companion, I gained a literary agent. And almost a month later, after the publication, the agent called me and said, "Hey, there's this game company that have a James Bond license to do a couple of Bond games, and they're looking for a writer, and I thought of you." So I did a couple of Bond games in the 80s, and then for the next decade I was writing and designing computer games. So I was definitely a writer and making a living at it.
And then the James Bond gig itself, you sort of touched on that with your previous answer, but how did you actually get involved in becoming the official author?
Well, it was late 1995, probably like the first week of November, I think. I got a call from Peter Jansen Smith, and he told me, he said, John Gardner wants to hang up his hat. He wants to retire after all this time. And we thought of you. We want to know if you want to give it a shot. So it just came out of the blue. It was nothing I campaigned for or anything. It was just like, I guess I'm just speculating that he thought, I knew the universe inside and out. And I had been writing a lot of fiction, not necessarily novels, but I had been writing, adventure stuff and fantasy stuff and all this stuff in the game world. I had written a first novel in the 80s, a mystery novel, a detective novel, and I had let him see it, and he'd read it, and he had some good notes for me, but we agreed this was not a publishable book. It's the proverbial first novel that you hide in a drawer and it never comes out, but it's what a lot of people experience with a first novel. So, but he saw, I think, that I could start a novel and finish it, which is very important. So I guess he had that in the back of his mind. Um, I know you're going to ask about the direction of the novels at that time. Might as well get into that here. We talked about, what should I do? Should I just continue on with John Gardner's sort of contemporary setting of Bond and just carry on from him? Or should we go back to the 1960s or the 1950s and create a whole new sort of bubble of timeline? And GoldenEye, the movie, came out, and it was a huge, huge hit. It kind of rebooted the series and kind of revamped everything. And so Peter thought, well, I think we should stay in sync with the movies. And in fact, we would like you to try to bring in a lot of the sensibility and feel of the movies, but stay, faithful to Fleming, if you can do that. And also make M a woman like the movies. So those were my only directives, was kind of make them feel a little more movie-like, make him a woman, and keep it contemporary. And I said, I'd like to keep my Bond with all his vices intact. I want him to still smoke and drink and womanize and all that. And they said, that's great. That's fine. If you can make that work, do it. So
Yeah, and
that's
you certainly sort of captured the feeling of the 90s. Really, when you read them, they're novels that are written in the 90s. They've got that sort of feel to it. I think if they're on TV, they'd have that sort of video look about them. They really are set in an era. But you said you take home from John Gardner. Did you liaise with John Gardner before the handover? Because I noticed in your first novel, Zero Minus 10, you mentioned a couple of his Gardner characters like Flicker von Groos.
right.
And
Right.
Gardner's final novel ends with a new female M being put in place.
Right. Um, so I knew John, and I had interviewed him for the James Bond Bedside Companion, and I'd done a big, extensive article for 007 magazine about his books and stuff that came out in the early 90s, way before I was the author. So we knew each other. Um, I just thought, since I was going to be writing in the 90s and just basically carrying on after him, in that first book, I did sort of have a little tie, like one step back into his books. I did that, and Peter and Ian Fleming Publications didn't have a problem with that. But I decided, and I guess maybe we talked about it, not to do that from then on. Just keep it in my sort of timeline, in my universe. I kind of look at it that every Bond author, whatever they do, It's their own little bubble. It's their own little timeline. Maybe the only thing we're really required to do is to not contradict Ian Fleming. We can contradict the other authors if we want. We can do something that the other authors, didn't do. And, it's one reason why I gave Bond back his Walter PPK, because I just felt that's Bond's gun. I'm going to give it back to him, so that's how that worked.
Yeah, fantastic. And as well as writing your own original novels, you also novelized one, two, three, four, three of the Pierce Brosnan films. I think James might touch on this a bit later, but the creative process for creating someone else's work into a novel as opposed to your own, I'm assuming they're very, very different.
It is very different. Yeah, John did Goldeneye.
Yeah.
Basically, it was whoever was in the hot seat at the time gets to do the novelizations. And the way it works, for the original novels, you have a whole year basically to do the work and write the novel and do all the research and do all the editing and everything. The novelizations, you get 8 weeks. That's it. Because it's kind of a rush job. The publisher needs the finished manuscript 6 months before publication, and the publication is when the movie comes out. So I would normally get the script. Eon sent me the script, the existing script at that time, and they were still filming and still changing the script every day. So I would get the script around May of that year, and I had to turn it in by July. So, and then every day through the fax machine would be new pages of the script. So, you're given the story, you're given the dialogue, you just have to flesh it out and turn it into prose, basically. And also, if you just turn every word from a screenplay into prose, you're about 30,000 words too short for a novel. So you do have to flesh it out. And I got permission to invent a few scenes here and there. For example, in Tomorrow Never Dies, I have a whole chapter about Wei Lin before she shows up in Hamburg, where we first meet her in the movie. Things like that. And I think that happens in all 3 books. A little bit of stuff that you didn't see in the movie. And ultimately, those books are slightly different from the movie because they keep changing the script, and which I think is a good thing. So you kind of have a little alternate version of the story through the novelization from the movie.
I mean, yeah, they're very much the sort of the stories of the movie, but they're very much you as well. They've got your stamp all over them. They feel sort of, especially Tomorrow Never Dies. They feel distinctive from from the film, from the script. It's not just a straight interpretation of the script, like you said. The bits about Wayland's background, etc., really does add to what could be a standard novelization. So really, really interesting to read those. I'm going to go on from you novelizing the novels into something you created in your own books. Criminal organization to rival Spectre called the Union. Can you tell us about the Union? Where, because for people who haven't read it, the Union are the villains in 3 of Raymond's books that are interlinked. Really, can you tell us about the Union, where they came from, how the idea came about, etc.?
Sure. Well, I wanted to use some kind of Spectre-like organizations, but I didn't want to use Spectre because at the time it was still kind of in a legal limbo, as far as not only the movies, but kind of in the books. I mean, John Gardner used them, but he stopped using them, because I think there might have been an issue. So I wanted something like that. I kind of played with an organization in the second book, The Facts of Death, the Decada. It's kind of a mini Spectre. It's just a small group of people in Greece. But then I wanted to branch it out and make a more worldwide thing. And because Spectre seemed to be a more a white collar organization, of rich guys, I wanted a more blue collar organization, a working class specter. And so that's how it came about. Um, I did conceive of the leader, being a blind man and all that for the first book, High Time to Kill. And I really didn't know that I wanted to do a trilogy until I was pretty much well into outlining that book and thinking, I could carry this over. I could kind of end with a little bit of cliffhanger. In fact, all my books, all six of my original Bond books, do kind of have interlinking stuff in them. I mean, High Time to Kill harks back to Facts of Death and the relationship between Helena and James Bond, and that's what gets the story going in High Time to Kill. But yeah, the three books with the Union, and then the sixth book, The Man with the Red Tattoo, still ties up some loose ends that were hung over from Never Dream of Dying. So, it's not really a trilogy. It's more like a quadrilogy or something. I don't know. But the Union is in just three books. And that's how that happened. I just decided I'm going to do a trilogy. I kind of ran it by Peter, I think, and said, "Hey, I want to do a trilogy." And he said, "Go for it." So,
Now I'm going to go off script a bit here. One a question I haven't planned before, but I'm just thinking in the final book of the trilogy, High Time to Kill. No, it's not. The first starts again, Edward. Never dream.
never dream
Sorry,
of dying.
Never Dream of Dying. Set in Cannes. Now, it's a bit of a cheeky thing of yours in there. He goes to the Cannes Film Festival. There's a couple of actors that have appeared in Bond at the Film Festival there. Were you tempted to say the actor Roger Moore or the actor Sean Connery was there? Would you have got away with that?
Oh, I don't know. I can't. Who did I say was there? I
Oh,
can't remember.
I can't. There were two of the actors who played Bond girls. I can't, for the life of me,
They were Bond
remember.
women, right?
Bond women, and he also mentioned the Coen brothers and Lynch, etc. But it just stuck
Yeah.
out. You'd picked actors who played, leading ladies in Bond films. I thought, was he allowed to? Was he going to put in the actor Sean Connery was there, or the actor Roger Moore was
Yeah,
there,
no,
and
I
not
didn't think
allowed?
about doing
No.
that. I didn't think about doing that. But Fleming did that. In
Yeah.
Honor Majesty's Secret Service, he mentions Ursula Andress and David Niven,
Mm.
and spotting them, and I think there is one is there one in You Only Live Twice? I can't remember. But anyway, so that was kind of my homage to
Yeah.
that, you know.
Yeah. You previously said the first the Union trilogy, High Time to Kill. You've on record as saying it's the favorite of your works that you've written. I'm sure you've been asked this question countless times before, but what is it about High Time to Kill that you think elevates it above your other work?
Well, I think of my books as like children, so I love them all, but I do think High Time to Kill is very unique among the whole Bond books. There's not another one like it, because it's got a mountain climbing plot, and half the book is spent on a mountain, climbing a mountain. It's and it's more of a one-on-one conflict between Bond and a school rival. Um, it's also it's also very sort of Hitchcockian, I think, with a MacGuffin, the MacGuffin of the Skin 17 that they've got to retrieve at the top of the mountain. So there's a lot of like disaster movie elements and other thing, pure adventure story, um, about it. And I just thought, it's probably my best plot, one of my best, certainly one of them anyway.
Fantastic. Again, another question you've probably been asked hundreds of times before, but I'm going to ask it again. When you're writing your Bond books, do you have a particular actor in mind? Are you the current actor or someone you'd cast as Bond? Are you thinking of anyone in particular?
That's an interesting question, but the answer is no. When I first read Ian Fleming, I was a kid in the 1960s, and I had already seen Goldfinger. That was my introduction to Bond was seeing Goldfinger on the big screen when it first came out. I'm that old. And then 6 months later, a double bill of Dr. No and From Russia with Love came out. So I had seen the first three films at the age of 9. And of course, that corrupted me forever. Um, So the image of Sean Connery was kind of, in my head. But then it was around that time that I did start reading the books. And, I was still pretty young and a lot of the stories kind of went over my head, but I could grasp the stories. I could grasp the story that Fleming was telling. I, of course, have reread the books over and over and over throughout the years and know them very well now. But at that first read, I I recognized that guy on the page was not Sean Connery. I kind of pictured some kind of dark, shadowy figure. you know. And from then on, for the rest of my life, anytime I read a Bond book, whether it was by Fleming or by anybody else, it was that shadowy guy. And in fact, he probably looks more like the drawing that by John McCluskey in the Daily Express comic books. That's kind of who I picture. Somebody like that. So that's who I was writing. However, I always found it extremely gratifying whenever a fan, a reader, would come up to me and say, and this happened several times, I can just picture Pierce Brosnan saying those words, or I could picture Sean Connery saying those words. Oh, I bet you wrote that for Timothy Dalton, didn't you? So if readers could picture their Bond in their head when reading my books, then I thought I succeeded.
Funny you're saying that. 0 - 10. I don't know why, because it wasn't like his era, but I pictured Roger Moore in that one. But I know, all your other novels, it was Lazenby. And I just don't, I can't tell you why, but especially DoubleShot. I can imagine Lazenby in sort of going around almost like punch drunk for the whole thing. It's, it's just, there's something about it, but another person can read it and see something completely different. But yeah, definitely it's, it's really, really interesting how how you did that. And I'm going to go on to another, possibly the secondary character in Bond. Now, Bond's best friend since right at the beginning, Felix Leiter. You've got a book coming out based on the man himself, Felix Leiter. Can you share anything about that book with us?
Well, a little bit. It's not out yet, so I can't give away any spoilers. It's called The Hook in the Eye. It does take place in Fleming's timeline in the early 1950s between Live and Let Die and Diamonds Are Forever. So it begins with Felix recuperating and in rehabilitation from losing his arm and part of a leg in Live and Let Die, and how he gets basically canned from the CIA and he joins Pinkertons, and so it's his first Pinkertons assignment in America. Um, so that was the concept. That was what I pitched to Ian Fleming Publications, and they went for it.
And when's it due out?
Well, they're doing something unique with the publication this time. They wanted to do a serial, an online serial. So the first way that anybody can read it is as an ebook. So the first, and it's going to be in 10 episodes. The first episode drops May 27th. And so if you're in the UK, you would order it directly from Ian Fleming Publications, and you would need, of course, a reading device and have it set so that it can accept updates to the files. So because every 2 weeks, the next episode would drop into that the file would just be replaced. Okay. Then at the end of the summer, I think in October is when they're going to publish the print book, the full book.
Fantastic. Well, Raymond, thank you very, very much for answering my questions there. You've been fantastic. I'm going to hand you over now to the much more erudite Mr. James Sylvester to carry on the interrogation.
Oh, bless you, Ed. And thanks again for calling me erudite. I don't think I've ever deserved such praise, but thank you. Raymond, again, it's a huge, huge pleasure. Coincidentally, this week, when I was ordered into the loft to clear it, I found my bought in 1997 copy of Tomorrow Never Dies, which, aside from Ian Fleming, which I read a similar age to yourself, I think, I hadn't read any of John's Bond books in between. And then when Tomorrow Never Dies came out, I saw the book in the shop. Thought, I'll get that. Loved every page of it. Not saying that because you're here, I really did enjoy it. And the bit that always stuck out for me was the background to Carver and his family upbringing, how he rose to power. Um, I even mentioned this on a different show with the guys when we reviewed the film a few weeks back. So it's one of those, as you said before, to Ed, you flesh out what you see on the screen. Great film for me. I think the book just adds another layer to it. So yeah, that was just a nice little memory, coincidental timing. So thank you for that.
I appreciate it.
You mentioned to Ed there in terms of the differences between novelizing a film and authoring your own books and your own Bond books specifically. And you touched on your process. You're much more time bound. I can't believe 8 weeks. That's astonishing. Believable in the movie world, I'm sure. But and also your mental image of Bond and your shadowy figure. Is that the same when you're writing from a film script and you're writing something that's going to be on screen? Do you see the actor
Oh,
there?
that's a good question. I think for the 3 novelizations, I did have Pierce in mind because that was his dialogue. I really couldn't change the dialogue that they wrote, but I could write new dialogue, stuff that wasn't in the script yet. So yeah, I think for those, I was thinking of the actors that were actually cast and everything, or at least how I would see them, because I had not seen any footage of the movie, so I didn't know how they were going to talk. But for example, I knew who Michelle Yeoh was. I'd seen her in a lot of Jackie Chan, the Jackie Chan movie and other things. And I knew who Jonathan Pryce was and stuff like that. So I could at least picture them in my mind. And interestingly, when I write my original books, I cast them in my head. Not necessarily Bond, but the other actors, the villains, the women. For example, in High Time to Kill, Roland Marquis, I cast Kenneth Branagh. No,
Right.
no, Jerem. Was it Jerem? No, it was Kenneth Branagh. Yes, Kenneth Branagh. It was Jeremy Irons that I cast in 0-10 as Guy Thackeray. Yeah, so Kenneth Branagh would be his, and at the time he was the right age, in the 90s. And the Hope Kindle, the woman up on the mountain with them, was Nicole Kidman.
Ah, excellent. I completely
And that just helps me write it. That just helps me write it. I don't try to convey that in the book that, oh, this person could be Nicole Kidman, but it just kind of helps me picture that person as I'm writing it, and it helps with their personality.
Yeah, it helps it flow, doesn't it? You can see real people there. It's good. Yeah, no, I appreciate that style. This will sound a really strange question because it's the kind of question I suppose when you're asked, like being asked, if you want to take a trip around the universe, you can't say no to it. But considering where you were at the time, you'd written the Bond Companion, your work was in the theatre and gaming. You had writing aspirations of your own in terms of novels and your own stories. So when you get that phone call and get asked, do you want to be the official Bond author? Is there any kind of reluctance? Is there anything in you that wants to say, actually, no?
Well, when I got the call, it was so out of the blue and a surprise. My first thought was, can I even do it? Do I have the ability to do it? I had never published a novel at that time. But I sure wanted to do it. I wanted to try. So I said yes immediately. I said, "Sure, I'll give it a shot," to use his words. Um, but yeah, it was a little scary, going through that audition period, hoping that they were going to like the stuff. And um, once I got the gig, yeah, I had to write the book. And then, that first book when it came out, 0-10, I was, what will the fans think? What will the critics think? I guess every writer goes through that. But this was a little different because it was the world of Bond. It's like Batman or Buffy or Star Trek or Star Wars or any of these that have huge fan bases and they're very opinionated. you know? And oh yeah, I got some pushback from some corners, but for the most part, it was successful. I mean, it was enough for um, the Ian Fleming Publications to let me do more. So
and we're very glad that they did. One of the things that stuck out, again, going back to your novelization of Tomorrow Never Dies, it always stuck with me was little character pieces. There were an aside that weren't something you see in the film, some little internal monologues of Bond's. I think there was the reference in there to him only having felt real love maybe twice in his life, besides the affections and deep affections or infatuations he's had with other people, which was a lovely piece of development and contributes to his growth, evolution as a character. A lot of times it's portrayed that Fleming's Bond was this stoic character who never changed from book to book, when I think really he evolves quite considerably.
He does. That's true.
I mean, within your own series, and given that they were so interconnected and hark back to each other, do you feel that your iteration of Bond had a similar growth, or its own growth, and was that in any way influenced by what was going on in the movies? I know there was the intention discussed to keep the books you were writing within that 90s feel, within kind of reflecting what was going on, but kind of really what extent were you influenced by what was happening on screen?
Well, aside from the very beginning when we talked about, kind of just keeping it in that feel, I wasn't really influenced, I don't think, by the movies themselves as they were coming out. Um, I was just concentrating on, what's my next story going to be? What's the next one going to be? And once I had established in Zero Minus 10 sort of the world of my books, then it just stayed in that world. That's all there was to that. I do think my Bond, there isn't, like you said, all the books are a little interconnected. And I don't, does he have a character arc? I mean, like you look at the Daniel Craig movies, there's a character arc there. There's an arc that they did in those 5 movies that don't exist in the other movies at all. Um, I don't, I think we were discouraged. All the authors are discouraged to go too far into Bond's background or stuff like that. Um, and so, personal growth is not something we want to do with Bond himself. Now, as far as growth between the stories, there's the connecting stuff, like in DoubleShot, Bond was injured in the previous book on the head, and that head injury is very much a plot point of DoubleShot. So there's that, and then Never Dream of Dying. There's elements of DoubleShot that creep into that, and so on. Now, in Man with the Red Tattoo, I did, since Bond is back in Japan, when Fleming had Bond in Japan, there was some serious personal stuff going on with Bond. He loses his memory and he gets married to Kissy, and they have a child, you know. And so, that was one thing I addressed in my first short story, the Bond short story, Blast from the Past. But going back to Japan, I could imagine that there would be a lot of ghosts for Bond. And I even kind of use that term. And at one point, he kind of has a little conversation with Kissy, who's dead. So whether, I don't mean for that to be taken literally, but in Bond's head, that's what's going on. So there's that. I got to play with a little bit with Bond's psyche a little bit.
I think, as you say, you're discouraged from character arcs and delving too much into the past. I think that's exactly the right approach. In the way you did that, you hark back to what were a lot of unanswered questions that came out of You Only Live Twice. Do it in the right way. It's going to have a psychological impact. It doesn't need to be the as dramatically played out, perhaps, as was in the Craig films in terms of this rather overpowering arc. But it's done respectfully and it answers questions that people have been wanting. So, I think it's exactly the way to do it. And I think, your readers will certainly appreciate the sensitivity with which you handled it. I'm curious because everybody knows you for your Bond work, and we're obviously talking about the Bond work, but you've very much got a reputation of your own outside of Bond. Does writing Bond, does the way you plan those stories, or just the character himself, does that influence you with your other writing work?
Well, my other writing is very different from Bond. They're more they're mysteries and they're thrillers, but they're more personal. They're more about every man than a Superman. They're more Hitchcockian. Hitchcock did a lot of movies about sort of an ordinary man getting caught up in extraordinary circumstances. So that's kind of what my books are, the Raymond Benson books. But my approach to writing is the same. I mean, there's two kinds of writers. There's plotters and there's pantsers. You've heard that term before.
Mhm.
Plotters are people who kind of plan it out and write an outline and figure out how it's going to end and all that stuff before they start writing. I do that. And then there's pantsers who write by the seat of their pants. They just sit down and start writing. And I admire those guys. I don't know how they do it. Stephen King is a famous pantser. Um, but I kind of look at writing as like building a novel, kind of like architecture. You got to have blueprints. So, I like to know where I'm going, you know, my outlines. I spend more time probably tearing my hair out over a 20-page outline than I do when I'm writing the book. All the so-called writer's block and trying to figure out the plot, that all happens in the outline stage for me. But that's good because it's only a 20-page document. And if there's something I don't like, I've written myself into a corner or something, I can throw out 3 paragraphs. If you've already written 3 chapters, that's a lot more painful to throw out, you know? So, I, you know, write if I was a professor at a college teaching creative writing, I would definitely teach the outline method, the plotter method. Now everybody has
Yeah.
their own method. All authors have their own method of writing, and some, abhor outlining, but I think it's a very useful tool because once you have the outline and you have your research, my outlines are basically a prose treatment block, broken out by block paragraphs, and each block paragraph represents a chapter. What happens in that chapter? I put in that paragraph. This is the plot information that we learn in this chapter. And I do that, chapter by chapter until I reach the end. And so when I'm writing the book, I look at my outline, I go, okay, I have to accomplish that in this chapter. But then I'm free to write the chapter. I can do whatever I want. I can do whatever dialogue or description or anything, as long as those plot points get conveyed. And that's how I stay on track when I'm writing the novel. Writing the novel is just basically then kind of tedious. It's just a little bit every day. But you don't have to like go, oh, gee, what am I going to have the character do now? Because I've already done that.
I'm so pleased to hear you say that because not in any way near your league, of course, but I write books, I write spy thrillers as well, and that's exactly what I do. Everything is planned out. Everything, I know exactly where it's going to go. Exactly that method. Yeah, paragraphed out. This is where I need to get to. And yes, to hear you say it, the great Raymond Benson, I'll take that one. Given that you've had your success with your Bond books, you've got your success with your own work. You've been retired from Bond, from Bond, and I promise you this isn't a pun, given the title of your forthcoming book. But what ultimately was the hook that got you back into the universe of Bond after taking this break?
Well, I've always loved Felix Leiter. I've always felt like, certainly in the movies, he was never portrayed as Fleming's Felix. I mean, this is not to denigrate any of the actors who played Felix in the movies, but seems that he was always different. He was always a different character. He was never the same tone or same personality, you know. And he definitely has a personality in the Fleming books. He's this jovial, upbeat guy who's a joker. He's kind of a goofball, He's the kind of guy who comes up behind Bond on the street, sticks his hook in his back and goes, "Stick him up," ha ha ha. And then they go out drinking and eating themselves silly, and then Felix kind of mansplains America to Bond every time he's over there. He's going, well, Las Vegas is this and this and this, and oh, we're going to go up to horse track and be careful and do this and that and do that, and he just, oh, you're going to order this and you're going to like it. you know, Here, try this drink and you're going to love it. That's Felix Leiter, and I wanted to explore him. And he is a Texan, and I'm a Texan, so I kind of identify with the guy. So I had kind of pitched a Felix Leiter novel over the years, a couple of times to IFP, and it just wasn't in their cards at the time, for their publishing strategy or whatever. But as you've noticed lately, they've started to branch out into some spinoffs. Kim Sherwood's doing the Double O series. She's got 2 books out now, and there's a third one coming. Wasim Khan is doing a Q novel. So I thought, well, I'll pitch it again, and I did, and they said yes, we would like this. So that's how it happened.
That's fantastic. We coincidentally had some time with Kim. I think around this time last year, probably, wasn't it, chaps, when we were talking about Double or Nothing. Lovely writer, very, very, very,
Yes.
very approachable.
Yeah.
And I mean, it sounds like it obviously is the opportunity of a lifetime in terms of fleshing out a character properly who's never been properly realized. Because, as you say, the actors are all great; they all bring their own thing to it. But it's not just the same as recasting Bond. Every time Felix shows up, he's somebody completely new. It's a different
I know. It's
personality.
just, I know. I mean, well, 2 actors have played it more than once,
Mm.
but and they were totally different. And we never saw him with a prosthesis, which
Mm.
is such an important part of Felix.
Yeah.
And I really wanted to tackle that. I wanted to present an entire Felix adventure, complete with the hook.
Well, we're really, really looking forward to that one. And we've touched on it there with the I don't want to say multiverse of Bond these days. Don't like to use that term with Bond, but we've got all these branches. We have spin-offs, and we have book series going in different directions, and we're all waiting to see what Amazon does with the cinematic property now, and that could go anywhere. We're all excited to see what happens. Is there any part of you that's curious about what your Bond is up to today, and any bit of you that'd like to revisit him sometime?
You mean the Bond I was writing?
Yeah.
No, I don't really think about that. I mean, I kind of look at it as, the famous line, "I had my 6." And those are the 6 that I'm very, very proud of, and I love them. And you know, I don't know if I would go back to writing Bond if I was asked. I don't think I would. But I like going to Felix. I think that's something I want to do. Other people are writing Bond now, and I'm just as interested to see what they do. You know, um, Anthony Horowitz, I thought did a great job. I like Charlie's last book. Um, we're all a big family, all the authors. It's kind of interesting. Um, at one time, I used to say, there were more people who landed on the moon, who walked on the moon, than Bond authors. Now I'm not sure if that's true anymore, but I'd have to count. But it's kind of a unique little family, and we all like each other, and we all respect each other.
Mm. And that's really, really pleasing to hear. And it's obvious from the way the authors interact and on social media and what we see. It's delightful. And well, I must admit there is a bit of me that wouldn't mind seeing your Bond again. As you say, it's a big world out there. There's lots of people giving their take, and each one is fascinating. But I'm sure the other lads are as pleased as myself that we got your 6. So yes, long may they be praised. And Again,
Thank you.
I really do appreciate your time with us. It's an honor, sir.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So, really, really fantastic evening with Raymond Benson there. Thank you again, Raymond, for joining us and sharing your insight into writing Bond, but also giving us a tantalizing glimpse of what we can expect with the Felix Leiter book, which we will all be buying when it gets dropped fortnightly from the end of May. And if anyone who knows me is listening, it's out on paperback for Christmas. So hello, Christmas list. So one of them as well. But yeah, absolutely brilliant. And again, a massive thank you for coming on. So to wrap up, Ash usually says, and on that bombshell. So I'm not going to say it because that's Ash's thing. I'm just going to say a massive thank you from me.
A massive thank you from me.
And a massive thank you from me.
Well, thank you guys. And thanks for having me.
Your time has been very, very much appreciated. Thank you so much.